Callias had never seen anything like it before. The Imperialis was magnificent, its gleaming metal hull standing against the black of space in a way that nearly overwhelmed him. For 2 decades he had labored, giving sweat, blood, and even limbs to both the Legion and the Iatros. Now he was the Nauarchus Princeps, commander of the 5th Flotilla, yet this achievement seemed almost inconsequential in comparison. With 520,000 cubic gratis of void displacement and over 3,000 remiges at its service, the Imperialis was a vessel worthy of Mars himself. To be chosen amongst the countless officers of Caesar's forces to helm such an engine of war was an honor that Callias felt undeserving of, yet he was determined to rise to the occasion. "Is it not splendid, Lucius?" he remarked, his gaze fixed upon the ship. His second-in-command, rumored to have Spartan lineage, responded with a mere grunt. The 3 days they had spent waiting at the Ravenna dockyard in Jupiter's orbit had yielded little more than that from Lucius. Callias turned, his expression one of bewilderment and a hint of accusation. "Truly, does nothing stir your interest?" he pressed. After a moment, Lucius replied in a deadpan tone, "It is quite impressive, sir." Callias chuckled. "Oh, Lucius, the men speak of you as they do for a reason. A man of your years should have more vigor. Come, let us proceed." Without a backward glance, Callias pivoted on his heel and strode away from the observation deck, the rhythm of his artificial legs squeaking leather and thumping metal accompanying his steps. The Venusian rebellion had robbed him of his leg, but in return he had received something far more valuable, the chance to stand on Capitoline Hill, a matter that had drawn the ire of many. "The wait is explained," Lucius murmured under his breath. Now, be friendly, Lucius," Callias whispered back, before raising his voice to the formation before him. "Hail, men of the 9th Legio Veneris." The centurion at the front replied earnestly, "Hail, Nauarchus Princeps Callias. The Imperialis greets you. May you guide her well and fulfill her purpose." At that signal, the 80 men behind the officer crashed their boots into the steel underfoot in a synchronized manner, filling the terminal with a resounding crump of stamping feet. That sound always pleased Callias. There was nothing that embodied the military more than the noise of many feet moving in unison, and the crisp, well-drilled example before him brought a smile to his face. He returned with the customary reply, making the sign of Neptune with his hand raised in the air. "And may she part the void swift and bring us victory true." As they made their way through the docking tube, Callias said to his Optio, "Remind me, if you would, where exactly we are taking this magnificent ship." The answer was even slower coming than usual. "The Senate has requested we rally the recently shattered Galaxis front before pushing on to capture the Arcanum system," Lucius reported with the same gusto a slave found in a whip. Callias tapped his fingers against his leg, the metal one, as he thought. He stopped when the name finally pried loose some information in his mind. "Isn't that the one with the aliens that eat you alive, where the 7th Legio Martis was lost?" "The very same, sir," Lucius sighed. "How uncivilized." "Well, that explains your dour mood, Lucius," Callias said. Lucius remained silent, his expression growing more sullen. Callias clapped the man on the shoulders and spoke. "Lucius, cheer up. The Roman Empire has endured for over 3,000 years and expanded to become the largest domain ever wrought. A few troublesome Xenos won't bring it low." "The Xenos don't exactly breathe, sir," Lucius replied. "Well, it's a good thing we're going to kill them, not invite them to bathe," Callias laughed. "And in the 100 campaigns I've fought, I've yet to find better killers than us." The Roman military's lack of imagination was well known among the troops. A common jest was that inspecting your gladius could mean visiting various locations. This no longer seemed amusing to Marius. Nearly 4 months had passed since they were cut off, stranded on Primus with only rocks and grass in sight, and aliens lurking between them. The scattered supply crates at his feet had dealt the final blow to his good humor. The promised ammo GLDS had turned out to be .5 UNCEA rounds for aircraft rotary cannons. His communicator beeped. "Find anything?" the voice said. "No, Decimus, there's nothing here," Marius replied. "What? How can there be nothing? This was the largest depot in the area. Are you certain?" Well, unless you have a gladius stashed up your ass, there's nothing here, Marius bit back. Marius, Decimus said. Marius had always known Decimus was not particularly bright, and his failure to grasp certain concepts had resulted in more punishment details than a single legionary could reasonably deserve. That joke was also becoming tiresome. Marius pushed the words out. Oh, I'm sorry. How foolish of me. Perhaps we should all hop on and fly back to Mars. Decimus, you truly are a scholar. How could I fail to realize the very thing I'm carrying in my Yes. All right, I understand, Marius, the man implored. But damn it, the centurion won't be pleased. Marius scoffed and turned his back on the supply room, intending to head to the surface. What's he going to do, make us hold a squat until we expel ammunition? Something like that would have usually elicited a reaction from his fellow legionary, but there was no response. Decimus? Marius ventured. Decimus, are you there? Swearing under his breath, Marius slipped his rifle off his shoulder and brought it to bear. If anything, the idiot had probably switched off his communicator by accident. He hoped that was all it was. It took only a minute or so for Marius to reach the central corridor of the underground supply depot. He had never been in this particular one before, but the Legion stamped out buildings like they stamped out legionaries. If you've seen one, you've seen them all. With his weapon still welded to his cheek, Marius approached the cargo elevator and tried again to raise the other man. Decimus, you bastard, answer me. He rose hastily as he heard the gate roll to the side. Any moment now they would come pouring out, and he would be facing certain doom. In his desperation, he came up with a plan. A desperate plan, one worthy of his good friend Decimus, who had most likely passed into the afterlife. But if for nothing else, Marius had to survive. After all, Decimus probably didn't even have the 2 denarii to pay the boatman, wasting his pay as he did on whores and drink. He retrieved a fragmentation grenade from one of the many pouches strewn about his body and set the timer for 20 seconds with a flick of his thumb before dropping it at his feet. With his other hand, he retrieved his entrenching tool, a short handle, not much longer than the width of his palm, its center filled with a ferromagnetic fluid that could be manipulated to take different shapes at the emitter, anything from a pickaxe to a shovel. He set it to Gladius, an actual gods-forsaken Gladius. It was purely ceremonial. He had no idea how to use the actual thing. Nevertheless, a grim smile crossed his face as he brandished the weapon and faced the oncoming mass of Caton. He wasn't shot or blown up or stabbed through the stomach, as he expected to be. The dozen Higgs actually stopped in their tracks. It was surreal. They parted like water as one of their members strode forward, each lowering their weapon and peering at him with their triangular heads. Marius was astonished. Decimus had always gone on and on about the Higgs, how they couldn't say no to a duel, how they loved to fight blade to blade like in some period vid. Marius had ridiculed him, telling him how no sentient creature could be so stupid to follow such archaic ideas on the modern battlefield. Turned out he was wrong. The one that approached him was far larger than the others, and also had a purplish hue to him. Marius imagined this was the leader, unable to turn down the challenge or look weak in front of the others. After all, they were far larger than any human. With a slick sound of gushing fluids, a thick serrated appendage burst from its forearm, dripping sickly orange. Marius stepped back, one foot after the other, not too quick to invite attack, but he couldn't afford to be too slow. The arm of the T-junction he was leading them down was much narrower than the main corridor, and it forced them to pack in closer to watch what was surely an easy butchering. A thought crossed Marius's mind. What if the grenade failed to detonate? Had it truly been 20 seconds already? Foolish human, you dare to challenge me, it hissed. You humans never grasped your place in the galaxy? Marius was surprised to hear Latin dripping from the creature's mandibles, thick and sinuous, bubbling like a cauldron of worms. It drew closer. Damn, was the grenade a dud? Had he set the timer incorrectly? Did he have 4 denarii on him? Crack. The grenade exploded. It was not like the videos, no great gout of flame or percussive thump, only an invisible flicker of air accompanied by the sound of a large stick, snapping in half in a flurry of metal. It eviscerated them, spattering Marius with a thick orange slurry of chitin and guts. He had no time to savor his victory, however, as a shard of metal struck his helmet, knocking him unconscious. When he finally reached his seat in the center of the room, he settled in with a subtle adjustment of his cloak. "Well," he projected his voice, "this is no patrician soiree. Attend to your stations. I want us on a heading to Galaxis as soon as possible." At his command, the room burst into a flurry of activity, and Callias sank deeper into his seat, listening to the hum of human voices punctuated by the rapid staccato of mechanical keys. It had been another day of waiting, but they were finally reaching their first destination. When the helmsman turned to him to speak, Callias simply gestured for him to continue, already knowing what he would ask. "Sol Gate LC, Delta Delta 306, 5th Flotilla on approach, and requesting priority WGT to Galaxis. Advise, ready to copy. This is Sol Gate LC, ready to copy. Priority code Lambda Mufi Rho Zeta 863. Priority code Lambda Mufi Rho Zeta 863 received. Clearance on request, stand by." Callias did not turn his head when he heard the patter of leather-soled feet and saw a tall shadow fall over him. There was only one man that tall who walked so silently. "Ah, Lucius, glad you could join me," he said. "And here I thought you disliked being on the bridge during a tunneling." The Optio nodded but said, "I have news. The Xenos are sending an emissary to meet with us at Galaxis. They wish to speak terms." The last few words were spoken with more force than usual. When Callias remained silent, Lucius simply waited, nervously looking out the viewport at the front of the room, as a small silver ring floating in space slowly grew larger and larger. "Delta Delta 306, clearance granted, advise ready to copy. Delta Delta 306, ready to copy. Delta Delta 306 is priority cleared to Galaxis via Gate 05, WGT method. Approach to 1200K, expect alignment in 15 minutes. Departure FRAC 112, Squawk 9756. Delta Delta 306 priority cleared to Galaxis via G05, WGT method. Approaching to 1200K, expecting alignment in 15 minutes. Departure FREC L113-12, Squawking 9756. Delta Delta 306, the readback is accurate. Contact Gate 05 on L142.60 for final alignment. Bonum fortunum. When Lucius felt he could barely restrain himself from leaving, Callias finally responded. "Very well, we shall greet them appropriately. I've heard Galaxis is renowned for its crawfish. Why don't we invite some others and host a banquet?" With a quick nod, Lucius hastily departed the bridge, just as a swirling cobalt light flooded the room. This was the first time Callias had laid eyes on a Hyglian in person. Of course, he had seen numerous data pics and videos since learning he would be facing them, but the reality was quite different. He struggled to parse any of its body language or facial expressions, though he doubted Xenos had such features. Still, he took some satisfaction in the twitching of its mandibles as he cracked open another crawfish and noisily extracted the succulent flesh within. He had consumed nearly 30 before deciding he had indulged enough, wiping his mouth with a napkin and discarding it on his plate. Unsurprisingly, the plates placed before their guest, a lone Hyglian, remained untouched. The arrogance of sending an emissary without any escorts had irked Callias, but not enough to completely ruin his mood. No, that had happened once the Hyglian began to speak. "Human," it said, "your armies have been scattered, your fleets burned. There is no sense in continuing to struggle. Submit to your betters." Callias took a long sip of his wine, studying the creature before him, unaware that he was idly tapping his mechanical leg. All other conversation had ceased. 16 fleet officers and various officials were present at the behest of the new commander of the Galaxis front. There had been some initial resistance after hearing a Hyglian would be in attendance, particularly from the civilian governor, a corpulent figure named Gnaeus Apronius. But in the end, Lucius had persuaded them all in a manner Callias had never felt the need to employ. "Your oratory really leaves something to be desired, my Hyglian friend," Callias replied. "Perhaps it is the fault of the translators, but you speak in a very dull manner, and you also trample on our hospitality." Callias stood and started to walk around the dining table, approaching the alien with a friendly smile. The other humans looked on warily, unsure of what the commander intended. The banquet had been an amusing jest, but there had been no warning of something like this. When Callias was about a foot away from the creature, he picked a crawfish up from the untouched plate and brought it in front of its face. "Perhaps you simply don't know how it is eaten," Callias said. "Here, it is actually quite simple." Before he could take any further action, the Hyglian slapped the morsel of food from Callias's hand, scattering it across the floor. There was a moment where no one moved. Some of the officers had actually started to sweat under their starched collars. No one, not even the Hyglian, saw it coming. When Callias sent a vicious kick into the Xeno's torso, the alien folded like a house of cards and was driven into the marble flooring with a sickening crunch. Immediately, every other human stood and drew a sidearm, training it on the supine figure, even though they all shared the same look of utter confusion. Callias settled his clothes back onto his frame before placing his foot on the Hyglian's chest. It was already bleeding from several places, and its carapace had been cracked. A high-pitched whine of straining servos filled the room as Callias started to slowly crush the remaining life from the emissary. "What is the meaning of this?" the alien gasped. "Lucius, help me enlighten our guest, would you please?" Callias said. "What is the total frontage in the Hyglian theater?" Lucius cleared his throat before speaking. 84 systems, sir." Callias continued to stare down at the emissary. "And how many legions have we committed to its execution?" he asked. The others had lowered their sidearms. Some looked on with interest, others disgust. And the governor seemed so green you could confuse him for a dryad. 392, sir," Lucius replied without hesitation. His excellent memory was part of what endeared him to his superior. Callias smiled and gave an almost imperceptible nod. "Excellent. Now, what is the total frontage in the Piltic Theater?" 304 systems, sir." "And how many legions have we committed to its execution?" 2,653, sir." "And the total frontage of the Lycenia Theater?" 1,206 systems, sir." "And how many legions have we committed to its execution?" 23,000 exactly, sir." The press of Callias's leg had continued downwards, extracting more and more blood from the alien beneath his boot. The amount of blood and its stench of rotting fruit was astounding. The governor had already vacated his stomach, and even some of the military men were wincing as they realized the Hyglian was still alive. "Do you understand now, Xeno?" Callias hissed. "You are nothing but insects. Insects who are so insignificant that their extermination is a political dead end, a task given to someone they wish forgotten, like the incompetent you manage to best." Callias lifted his leg and brought it crashing down into the emissary's left arm, severing it and eliciting a gurgling hiss. "I understand your civilization has been spacefaring for almost 10,000 years, Callias mentioned. "You should have strangled us in the cradle. Now it's too late. This is humanity's era. Your history as a people will end as a stepping stone for one Roman officer, a footnote in his biography. How pathetic." With a final heave and a yell, Callias stamped on the emissary's head. He then turned covered in ichor to the remaining guests and gave each of them a look in the eye. "Lucius, get this cleaned up." "Is that you, Decimus?" Marius rasped, the words scraping his throat like grains through a grindstone. "Decimus?" he tried again. The shadow recoiled with a yelp, and Marius felt himself falling before a sudden stop that sent lances of pain through his skull. "By the gods, Marius, you're alive!" a familiar voice exclaimed. "You nearly made me soil myself." Marius let out a soft groan. "Alive, Decimus? No, we must be dead. I hear the hissing of the sticks, and the sky is blood red. Where else could we be?" Decimus lifted the makeshift litter and continued forward, Marius's ankles dragging through the long grass. It was some time before he answered. "Of course the sky is red, Marius. The sky is always red on Primus." Primus. At that word, Marius lurched and tried to stand, only to be stopped by a heavy hand. "You should stay on the litter. We're almost at camp," Decimus said. Marius slumped back as the weight of his body and the hand overcame him. "How long have you been walking, Decimus?" Marius asked. "We drove for hours." There was a grimace in Decimus's voice. Almost 3 days. Gods, I'm thirsty. The fucking Higgs blew away the bike and all our shit with it. But we're almost there. Almost there. Tears began to fall unbidden down Marius's cheeks. He scraped at them and looked at the moisture on his fingers, as if they belonged to someone else. A red smear of dried blood coated his fingers in an oily grit. "You fucking coward," he choked out. "You should have left me behind. Your trick worked, you glorious bastard. But where the fuck were you? Fuck you." Decimus's pace was hardly disturbed, his feet continuing their steady rhythm on the earth. "You're not yourself, Marius. You got hit pretty hard, even busted open your helmet. The Iatros will sort that out. Don't worry," he replied. "It really isn't far now." Marius wanted to yell and scream and curse, not weep like a girl donning her tunica recta, but he found he couldn't gather the strength. His exhaustion overtook him, and soon he was asleep. When he came to next, it was in the shade of a fabric canopy, his lips covered in beeswax and a bandage stifling the left side of his face. It was only scant minutes later that the Iatros found him, subjected him to all sorts of questions and tests, and then dismissed him from the bed, muttering about there not being enough. It was only when Marius stood, dressed in his armor once again, that he realized what the doctor meant. The cot he had just vacated stood in the center of row upon row of dying men, their blood-stained, bandaged bodies shifting ever so slightly with the soft susurrus of breathing, resembling a trampled field of poppies disturbed by the wind. Bile threatened to rise from Marius's throat as a heavy weight occupied his stomach. He grabbed the first nurse he could find by the arm, a slight girl who must have been no older than 14 or 15. She winced as he held on to her. "I'm looking for a legionary, Decimus Coolio. Do you know if he's here?" he said. The girl tried to pull away from him, causing Marius to start as he noticed his hand clamping down on her with far more strength than he had intended. He let go, but before he could apologize, she fled. Cursing himself, Marius stalked the aisle of the field hospital, reading the names hastily scrawled on scraps of paper taped to the cots. Gaius, Gnaeus, Tiberius, Marcus, Decius. There were dozens and dozens of names. It was after an hour of frantic searching that he found who he was looking for. Decimus, staring up at the canopy as he had not long ago. "Decimus? I said some things," Marius began, but Decimus waved him off. A tingle, an itch, some kind of compulsion pressed upon Marius then. It exhorted him to pull a trigger, to trigger a bomb, to throw a punch, bludgeon with the butt of a rifle. But that was wasted here. He couldn't help but let his eyes linger on the empty space where his friend's arm should have been. "As I said, you weren't quite yourself," Decimus remarked with a smile. "No matter. I'll get a new arm, a better one, and never lose another arm wrestling match at the Papana." Marius felt the hint of a smile fade into his shame before vanishing into the void. He sat beside his friend's cot, running a hand through his shaggy hair that had grown over the past months. "You should have left me behind," Marius murmured, "and deprived the Higgs of all that perfectly good meat. I simply thought I might need a snack on the way back." Decimus tried to laugh, but it came out as a dry, hacking cough that sprayed pink-tinged spittle into the air. Marius stood ready to call for help, but Decimus pulled him back down. "Leave it. I'll be fine. There are more ailing legionaries for them to tend to, especially now that I can't even salute properly. The centurion won't be pleased," Decimus said. This time, Marius broke into a smile and then a full-bellied laugh, as Decimus looked on with bewilderment, unsure if he had missed the actual joke. But before Marius could collect himself, a commotion swept through the camp. Runners dashed through the field hospital, shouting at the top of their lungs, "Spores! Spore attack! Everyone, get to cover now! Now! Spores!" Marius heard, but his legs seemed to have betrayed him, rooting him to the ground. The nearest trench line lay 100 meters ahead, with the field hospital placed behind their lines. The distance appeared insurmountable. All the spore netting they had managed to gather had been placed with the main body of the legion. "It's too far," Marius found himself whispering. "Juno's cunt, Marius. You'll get killed. Leave me and run, you dolt." As if on reflex, Marius felt his legs unstick, and he rushed forward. Adrenaline and blood surged to his muscles, leaving his mind blank and his body on the edge of a fatalistic hysteria. He ran with reckless abandon, his lungs straining, the weight of the other man forgotten. A final burst of energy filled him when he saw the faces peeking out from beneath the spore netting hanging over the trenches, waving him down with their faces twisted into silent yells. The roar was overwhelming now. The vibrations traveled through the ground and right up into Marius's stomach. With a final push, he jumped into the gap, dragged open by the other legionaries, and tumbled to the ground with Decimus. The cloud hit like a tidal wave, screaming like the Five Furies and tearing at the netting as if with claws. The steel framing groaned under the weight of the assault, and the cries of tortured metal twisting in on itself punctuated the terror like the cries of demons in the night. 10 seconds, 20, 30. Marius tried to count them, but found himself constantly losing his place. Even with the chaotic cacophony convulsing above his head, the beat of his heart hammered into his eardrums. Once again, time stretched as the storm seemed to go on without end, as if the spirits required more time to deliberate over his fate. Perhaps he would be fortunate enough to make do with a sop to Cerberus for being killed on such a gods-forsaken planet, or perhaps they didn't even have power here. Surely not everyone in the seventh was forsaken, not that young girl, the nurse. He began a short prayer for her, if any, to come out of this alive. And then it was over. There was not a sound but the murmur of settling dirt, and it was another long minute cowering in their trench before the piercing whistle of the centurion cut through the silence. Like dogs, every man in the trench jumped to their feet, even Decimus with his missing limb. 2 men exited to the rear through the netting as each legionary prepared his weapons. Decimus and Marius, empty-handed and injured, were ordered to man the heavy machine gun by the decanus of the contubernium they had stumbled into. There was no time nor opportunity to find their own squad. Besides that, no one spoke as they prepared, loading their weapons, checking grenades, and dialing in their sights. They had done this hundreds of times before, and would do so hundreds of times again. Even with his hands shaking as they did, Marius had no trouble loading the machine gun and passing the other end of the belt to Decimus. They were ready when the netting came down to reveal the landscape around them. The rolling green hills of Primus had been devastated. Where the long grass once stood was nothing but spires of pale yellow fungi, bursting out of the earth like the fingers of the dead coming back to life. As Marius trained the barrel of his weapon along the horizon, he couldn't help but spot the human-shaped lumps sprawled across the ground with tall stalks of blood-red fungi jutting from them like pila. One of them was still alive, clawing at his own body as the spores ate through his armor and into his flesh. Marius clenched his jaw as the urge to shoot the man almost overcame him. But no, there were other shapes approaching in the dust. No one moved, no one spoke. It was as if the legion was collectively holding its breath as the enemy came closer and closer. The storm had passed, yet the ground had continued to shudder beneath their feet and travel up their bones to rattle their brains and their skulls. It was only as the dust began to settle that they got their first glimpse at what approached. Like whales breaching the ocean's surface, enormous chitinous shells emerged from the dust. In reality, the substance was the dead spores left behind by the storm, and it ran in thick rivulets over the backs of the huge creatures, slowly unveiling their true form. They were like tortoises if such animals were 8 times a man's height, 15 of his arms span, and a chittering mass of teeth had replaced the head. They were not all beast either. They had been surgically lashed to an ostatite harness, and its thick yellow hide fused to pearl-black plates of battle armor. Looking like the elephants of Hannibal, they also carried with them casemates and pillboxes on their backs that looked to have been somehow grown from their shells. Armored gantries were also affixed to the harness, providing fortified firing positions and strongholds. Marius could see the Hygleian outriggers scurrying around on them. Some manned the numerous weapons bristling across the surface, while others prepared rappelling ropes. Though still nearly 3 kilometers away, once the Tessudines reached the Romans, scores of Higgs would descend from them in assault. These were a fusion of fortress and siege engine, and the twisting spires of their carapace evoked the tall towers of ancient structures. 3 gargantuan beasts emerged from the dust, their heads rising as they began to roar. The deep, gravelly sound was like a glacier grinding against a mountain, accelerated. It pierced straight into Marius's body, resonating in his lungs. Then the bombardment commenced. The largest guns on the war beast's backs opened fire, punctuating their roar with a different kind of clamor. White-hot trails streaked against the red sky, arcing overhead before crashing down, screeching for the deaths of their targets. The shells landed, stitching a line of exploding geysers across the Roman fortifications. Marius saw one shell land squarely within a fire bay, just 30 meters ahead, and the men operating it simply vanished, leaving only a splotch of upturned earth and a crater to mark their passing. One of Marius's comrades in the contubernium ducked beneath the trench's lip as the shell splashes scattered shrapnel and body parts, only to be pushed back to attention by the decanus. "Man your post, you boy lover," he yelled. "You know what's coming." This was what they had all been waiting for. The dust had yet to fully settle, still swirling around the legs of the Tessudines. The Romans had made the mistake of seeking cover during this type of attack before, and they would not be fooled again. It was just as the reprimand ended that it came. Whirring spheres of bone, 2 meters in diameter, bearing wicked spikes, came bursting out of the dust. Each was covered in over 1,000 stubby, razor-edged appendages that propelled the balls forward as they made contact with the ground. They cracked like whips as the creatures continued to accelerate. "Address! Address! Fraggers!" The shouts rang out, and without a moment's hesitation, the legionaries opened up and let out their pent-up frustrations. The cacophony of gunfire was deafening as the machine guns bucked in Marius's hands. The air grew thick with tracer fire as a veritable hailstorm of lead was expelled from the Roman lines like an exploding directional charge. Marius walked his fire across the fungi fields and laid it on the leading creature. At first, his bullets simply ricocheted, glancing hits that spun away, leaving a corkscrew of pyrotechnic chems in their wake. But as he reached the center of its mass, he was rewarded with meaty cracks of its shell and the shedding of its bright purple blood. The weight of fire from the line had almost completely stripped the leading fragger of its limbs, and soon it came to a stop, just a few dozen meters short of the forward breastworks. However, it was only one of many, and despite the Legion's best efforts, they were soon reminded of the creature's namesake. The first fragger to come to grips with them simply rolled over the first group of men, and the unlucky few caught beneath it were quickly flayed and dismembered by the multitude of serrated tentacles. A moment later, with a curling of its limbs, like a wound spring, the fragger hurled itself into the air above them. Its true form was like a pill bug, and as it flew over a section of trench, it unfurled itself to reveal the forest of spines it kept hidden on its underbelly. They were dipped in some kind of metallic substance, and they gleamed in the Primusian sun. Inside the fragger's body, with a spasm of its muscles, it crushed a series of glands all throughout its organs, and as the slime came in contact with its abdominal contents, it lit off an irreversible enzymatic reaction. The fragger swelled against its seams and burst in a cloud of purple haze. The spines shot out at supersonic speeds, breaking the sound barrier with a crack, and struck the men beneath, pinning them to the earth and tearing through their flesh in armor, as if nothing was there. The man who had taken cover earlier cried out, "Fuck! Fuck this!" and ducked down again. "Quintus, you scum, keep firing!" the decanus shouted, kicking the cowering man to the ground and glaring at him. "Man the lip, or I swear on my ancestors, I'll have you flogged until we survive this," he yelled, inches from the legionary's face. "And then I'll keep going until you're dead." Quintus scrambled up, raising his rifle, but a stray spine struck his left eye, scrambling his brain. His body fell with a thud as the deaconess turned back to the battle. The fragger attack was just the prelude, as the alien infantry, armed with submachine guns and glowing orbs, surged across the landscape, laying down machine gun fire to cover their assault on the Roman defenses. "Barrel!" Marius yelled as he heard the change in the pitch of his gun. "Barrel!" Decimus yelled back and began to rummage in the canvas bag beside them. At the same time, Marius slapped the side of the gun and popped the latch on the barrel housing before pulling the spent barrel free and replacing it with the one Decimus handed to him. All in all, it took him 6 seconds under combat conditions to make the swap. A dedicated machine gunner could do it in 4. "We have 1 belt left," Decimus said. "Then where's the bloody runner?" Marius replied. "Up Pluto's arse? I don't fucking know." he replied. Marius, who had long abandoned any kind of disciplined fire, was forced to cut back and rely on shorter bursts as the belt of ammunition grew shorter and shorter. It was only a few scant seconds later that with a final click, the machine gun ran dry. "That's it," Decimus said. "Decanus, your sidearm," Marius shouted down the line. Without hesitation, the Decanus threw his service pistol over, and Marius handed it to Decimus. For himself, he picked up the rifle of recently deceased Quintus and rummaged through the man's pouches for extra magazines. During the fighting, the Testudines had approached to under a kilometer away, and now the smaller caliber autocannons and heavy machine guns had joined in and were ripping into the Romans. Shell casings ran like rivers down the sides of the beasts, and their riders began to chant. The foot soldiers, too, joined in, and you could hear it despite the noise of the battlefield. So numerous were the voices. "Hig, hig, hig, hig!" "Come on, we have to find Decanus Silanus and the rest of our cohort," Marius said. Decimus flinched as a shot crashed into the sandbags around the machine gun position and sent a spurt of debris showering over him. He took a moment to spit out a mouthful of dirt. "In this shitfest?" he asked. "You must be mad." Without answering him, Marius turned and started down the trench line.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.